The forecast said light rain. That is what they had when they left. 3 days out of Sydney, Nova Scotia, headed east across the North Atlantic for the Azores, in a boat they had prepared for exactly this, in the summer, with a forecast that said light rain. What arrived was 45 knots of wind, rain coming horizontally, and seas that Charles Truax put at 20 to 30 feet. That is not a distinction sailors make for drama. 20 to 30 feet is the height of a 3-story building, arriving every 8 or 9 seconds, in the dark, with nothing on the horizon in any direction for 600 miles. They lost a sail. Then they found something worse. A piece of the rigging that holds the mast up had come loose, which meant that the mast itself was now on a clock. So they went forward to fix it, both of them, because on a boat crewed by 2 people, there is no third person to send. And while they were up there, working on the wire that was keeping their mast standing, a wave came aboard and took Barbara Truax off the boat. Her husband got to her. That is the part I want you to hold on to for the next 20 minutes, because it is the part that makes this different from almost every other story on this channel. He was not asleep below. He did not wake up to an empty helm. He did not find out hours later. He reached her, in the water, in a storm in the middle of the Atlantic, and he did not have the strength to lift her back in. He told a Canadian radio interviewer that, in those words, months afterwards, "I didn't have enough strength to pull her back in the boat." This is a story about a couple who did everything the way you are supposed to do it, and about the one thing nobody trains for. Before I go any further, a word about where this comes from, because it matters more here than usual. Most of what you are about to hear comes from Charles Truax himself, who spoke at length to CBC Radio in Newfoundland and Labrador about what happened, and from a fishing captain named Adams, who was one of the people who came out to help. There is no accident report I can point you to. There is no inquest transcript. What there is a man who lived it describing it in his own words, on the record, to a journalist, and the recollection of the people who came to look for her. So, when I tell you what he was thinking, or what it felt like, that is because he said so. I am not going to embellish it. It does not need it. Charles and Barbara Truax were doing the thing. Not planning it, not saving for it, not talking about it at a boat show. They were 3 days into an ocean crossing, which is the point at which the planning is over and you are simply out there. Their route was Sydney, Nova Scotia, to the Azores. If that means nothing to you, here is the shape of it. Sydney sits on the northeastern corner of Cape Breton Island, right at the top of Nova Scotia, and it is one of the classic jumping-off points for a boat heading east across the Atlantic. The Azores are a group of Portuguese islands sitting more or less alone in the middle of that ocean, about 1,800 miles away. 1,800 miles. For a cruising sailboat, that is something like 2 to 3 weeks of continuous sailing. There is nothing in between. That is not a figure of speech. Once you are a few days out of Nova Scotia, you are in a piece of ocean where the nearest help is a merchant ship that may or may not be within 100 miles of you, and the nearest land is under your keel, 3,000 meters down. People do this every year. Hundreds of boats make that crossing or one like it, and the overwhelming majority arrive without anything worse than a broken autopilot and some bad tempers. It is a known passage. It is not reckless. It is the thing that people who love sailing spend 20 years working towards. That is what these two were doing in July of 2017. It is worth being concrete about what an ocean crossing asks of 2 people, because the word crossing does a lot of hiding. From the moment you clear the land, somebody has to be awake and in charge continuously until you arrive. Not mostly, continuously. With 2 people, that means splitting the day and the night into watches and handing the boat back and forth. 4 hours on and 4 off, or 3 and 3 when it is rough, for 2 to 3 weeks without a break. Nobody sleeps properly. You sleep in your clothes, wedged in a berth that is moving, with an alarm set. You are woken every time something changes on deck, which in bad weather is constantly. By day 5, you are running a permanent sleep deficit, and by day 10, that deficit is affecting your judgment in ways you cannot feel from the inside. Everything else happens on top of that, cooking in a galley that is heeled over and moving, navigating, watching the weather and making routing calls that commit you for days. And when something breaks, and something always breaks, you fix it yourself, with what is aboard, because there is nobody to call. None of this is a complaint. It is the deal, and everyone who does it knows the deal and wants it anyway. Charles and Barbara Truax had signed up for exactly that, and 3 days in, they were doing it. If you are here for these stories, subscribing is the thing that helps most. It is how the channel keeps reaching people who actually want them told properly. Now the weather, because the weather is where this starts to go wrong, and it goes wrong in a way that is worth understanding rather than just hearing. The forecast called for light rain. What they got, in Charles's own description, was 45-knot winds, torrential rain driven by the wind, and 20 to 30-foot waves. He said plainly that they got smacked by quite the storm. 45 knots is a gale, roughly 50 miles an hour, sustained, with gusts above that. It is not a hurricane. It is not the once-in-a-lifetime event that this channel usually covers. It is weather that a well-found ocean boat with a competent crew is expected to survive, and usually does. But there is a gap between the forecast and the reality that is bigger than the numbers suggest, and it is the gap that hurts people. If you leave port knowing that a gale is coming, you make different decisions. You reef early, meaning you reduce sail area before you need to, while it is still easy and the deck is still relatively stable. You stow everything. You get food ready in advance because you will not be cooking later. You rig jacklines and you clip on. You decide in advance whether you are going to run before it, or heave to and stop. If you leave expecting light rain, you do none of that in advance. You do it while it is happening. Every single one of those jobs, the reefing, the stowing, the clipping on, now gets done on a deck that is moving violently, in the dark, in rain being driven into your face at 50 miles an hour, by people who are already wet and already tired. That is the real damage a bad forecast does. It does not just change the weather, it changes when you do the work. And doing the work late is what gets people hurt. They lost their jib. The jib is the sail at the front of the boat, forward of the mast. Losing it in a gale can mean many things. It can tear, it can partially unroll and start flogging itself to pieces. It can come loose. What matters is that a loose or damaged headsail in 45 knots is not something you can leave. It flails with enough force to break bones and destroy gear, and it has to be dealt with, on the foredeck, which is the worst place on the boat in those conditions. They struggled with it. Charles said they lost it and struggled to get it back. And then, in the middle of that, he noticed the thing that turned a bad night into a different kind of night entirely. A major part of the rigging had come loose. I need to explain what that means, because if you do not sail, the word rigging probably sounds like a general term for ropes, and it is not. The mast of a sailing yacht is a tall aluminium pole standing on the deck. It is not bolted into place like a flagpole. It is held upright by wire, tension steel cables running from high on the mast down to the sides of the boat and forward and aft. Those side wires are called shrouds. The whole thing is a system in balance. Every one of those wires is under enormous tension, and they hold the mast up by pulling against each other. If one of them lets go, the mast is no longer being held from that direction, and the wind, pressing on the sails, is pushing it exactly that way. When a rig fails, it does not bend gracefully. 60 feet of aluminium comes down, still attached by the remaining wires, and it goes over the side into the water alongside the hull. And then it becomes a battering ram, moving with every wave against a fiberglass hull that is not designed to be hit by its own mast. That is what a dismasting in a gale actually means. It is not the end of sailing that night. It is a serious risk of the boat being holed and sinking. So when Charles Truax looked up and saw that a shroud had come loose, he was looking at a problem that could not wait until morning. He and Barbara went forward to fix it. And here is the thing that people who have never been on a foredeck in bad weather do not picture correctly. The front of a sailing boat is the end that moves the most. In a seaway, the bow rises and falls through the largest arc of anything on the vessel. It can be lifting and dropping 15 or 20 feet, while the cockpit at the back barely moves in comparison. It is also the wettest place aboard, because every wave the boat drives into comes over the bow first, solid water, at speed. There is very little to hold on to up there. There is no seat and nothing to brace against. You are kneeling or lying on a wet, sloping, moving surface, using both hands for the job, which means you are holding on with nothing. Rigging work makes it worse still, because a shroud is attached at deck level right at the edge of the boat. You cannot do that job from the middle. You have to be at the side, at the rail, over the water, and it takes two people. One to hold, one to work, one to take load off while the other secures something. A single person, at night, in a gale, on a pitching foredeck, with a loose shroud and a mast about to come down, is not going to fix it alone. So both of them went. There was no version of that night where one of them stayed safe in the cockpit and the other one went forward, because the job could not be done that way. I want to be careful about how this next part is told, because a man is still alive who lived through it and has spoken about it publicly, and this is not a story where anybody did anything wrong. They were working on the shroud when a massive wave washed Barbara overboard. That is the whole of it. There is no error in it, no lapse, no moment where somebody made a bad call. Two people were doing a necessary repair in the only place it could be done, at the only time it could be done, and the ocean took one of them, and then Charles Truax got to her. I do not know the mechanics of it, and he did not describe them in the interview I have, whether she was still attached by a tether, whether he reached her from the deck, whether she came alongside. What he described was the outcome, and the outcome is the single most terrible sentence in any of these stories. He did not have enough strength to pull her back into the boat. Think about what that is physically. A person in the water, in foul weather gear, soaked through, is not the weight of a person. Wet clothing and a life jacket and boots add an enormous amount, and it is all dead weight. She would have been effectively unable to help. The boat's freeboard, the height of the deck above the water, might have been 3 or 4 feet, which is nothing until you are trying to lift a fully grown adult that distance, with no leverage, on a surface that is pitching 20 feet up and down, in the dark, having already been awake and fighting for hours. There is a reason that every offshore safety course spends time on recovery equipment. Not on finding the person, on getting them back over the rail, blocks and tackle, halyard hoists, purpose-built slings and ladders and lifting straps. All of it exists because the sailing world worked out a long time ago that a fit adult usually cannot lift another adult out of the sea by hand. It is the least dramatic part of man overboard training, and it is the part that kills people. Ask almost any cruising couple what they have aboard for a man overboard, and you will get a confident answer about the things that keep a person floating and findable. Life jackets, a horseshoe buoy, a Dan buoy with a flag, a light, personal locator beacons, an alarm that fires when a tag goes in the water. All good, all important. Ask the same people what they have rigged to physically lift a body out of the sea and back over the rail, and the answers get much quieter. The gear exists. There are lifting slings that a person in the water can be maneuvered into and then hoisted with a halyard on a winch, the same winch that raises the sails, which gives a small person the mechanical advantage to lift someone twice their weight. There are boarding ladders that can be deployed from the water. There are purpose-made recovery nets and scoop systems that let you roll somebody aboard rather than lift them. What almost nobody has done is practice it. Rigging a halyard to a sling, in the dark, in a seaway, single-handed, while someone you love is in the water alongside. That is a complicated sequence of physical tasks, and the first time you do it should not be the time it counts. He had her. And the ocean was stronger than he was. I would like to hear from you on this one. If you sail, what do you actually carry aboard for recovery, not just for flotation? Put it in the comments. It is a conversation worth having in public. What happened next is the part that says something good about the world, and I want to give it proper time. A Mayday went out, and the response was not a Coast Guard press release. It was fishermen. Around 7:30 that evening, a fishing captain named Adams steamed his boat over to the sailboat in distress. Fishing boats work that stretch of water off Newfoundland and the Burin Peninsula, and they are not fast, and going out into a gale towards somebody else's emergency is a decision with real consequences for the people who make it. He went anyway. So did others. Adams and the other crews spent the entire night scanning the water. A Canadian Coast Guard helicopter and a fixed-wing aircraft searched from the air. Understand what those men were doing, physically. Searching for a person in the water at night in 20-foot seas means standing on a moving deck with a light, looking at black water, for hours, knowing that the thing you are looking for is roughly the size of a football and is visible only when it happens to be on top of a wave at the moment your beam crosses it. Adams described the conditions afterwards with the understatement that fishermen use for everything. He said it was a poor old night, the wind going one way and the swell going the other, so you bend around a lot on a boat. That is a man describing a night of being thrown around in the dark while looking for a stranger's wife. They searched all night. And by lunchtime the following day, everybody was exhausted, and there was very little hope left. The honest reason there was very little hope has two parts, and neither is anybody's fault. The first is the water. The North Atlantic off Newfoundland in July is not warm. The Labrador Current runs down that coast carrying cold water south, and sea temperatures out there in midsummer sit in single figures Celsius, the sort of cold where an unprotected person loses useful movement in their hands and arms within minutes, and where survival time is measured in a small number of hours at best. The second is the sea state. In a 20 to 30-foot swell, a person floating at the surface is invisible for most of every wave cycle. They are in a trough, with walls of water on both sides, and they come into view only when they and the searcher happen to be lifted at the same moment. You are not scanning an open surface, you are scanning a corrugated one, and most of it is hidden from you most of the time. Put those together and you have the real arithmetic of a man overboard in an offshore gale, which is why the entire discipline is built around not losing the person in the first place, and around getting them back aboard immediately if you do. And then somebody had to say it. It was Adams who suggested that Charles make his way into land. I have thought about that moment more than any other in this story. A fishing skipper, after a full night of searching, having to be the person who tells a man that it is time to stop looking for his wife. There is no training for that either. Another fishing boat escorted him in to the Burin Peninsula, on the south coast of Newfoundland. That detail matters too. He was not left to sail in alone. Somebody stayed with him the whole way. A damaged boat, a man who had not slept, a rig that had already given trouble, and a fishing crew who simply would not leave him to do it by himself. But before that, he had to leave. He had to take his boat and turn it and sail away from the piece of ocean where his wife was. Charles Truax told the interviewer that his heart broke at that point. He said it was like losing my heart. And he said something else, which is the detail he cannot put down. He could not shake the memory of his wife's body floating in the water behind their boat. That answers a question this channel always tries to answer directly rather than leave hanging, which is how anybody knows what happened. In most of the stories I cover, there is no answer, no body, no witness, a presumption and a form. Here there is no ambiguity at all, and that is its own kind of cruelty. He saw her, he got to her, he could not lift her, and then he had to sail away from her, and he has carried the image of that ever since. More of these are coming. Researched the same way, real cases, sourced, and about the people rather than the wreckage. Subscribe if that is what you want more of. There are two things I want to leave you with, and neither of them is a lecture. The first is about the forecast. Not to blame it, marine forecasting over the North Atlantic in 2017 was doing its best with a system that had more energy in it than anybody expected, and the same thing happens today. But the practical lesson that experienced offshore sailors take from stories like this one is not about better forecasts. It is about assuming the forecast will be wrong in the direction that costs you. It is a very small change in behavior. Reef before you need to. Do the deck jobs while it is still merely unpleasant. Get the storm gear out while your hands still work. Put the harness on at the start of the watch, not when it gets bad, because when it gets bad, you will be too busy. The second is the thing that this story is actually about, and it is the one nobody puts on a checklist. Two people is a beautiful way to sail, and it is a brutally thin margin. Everyone who cruises as a couple knows the theory, that if one of you is out of action, the other one is single-handing. What Charles and Barbara Truax ran into is the harder version of that. Not that one of them was out of action, but that one adult, alone, in the middle of a gale, physically could not do what needed doing, because the human body has limits that willingness does not overcome. That is not a failure of seamanship. It is arithmetic, and the answer to it is equipment, a proper recovery system, rigged and practiced, so that the job does not depend on strength, and there is not a sailor watching this who could not go and check what is aboard their own boat this week. I want to finish with them rather than with the lesson. They were 3 days out. They had done the hardest part of the preparation, which is the years of it, and they had committed, sold up, provisioned, cast off, and pointed the bow at the middle of an ocean, together. Somewhere out there, in the worst of a night that was supposed to be light rain, both of them went forward to save the mast. Not one of them. Both. Nobody sent Barbara up there, and nobody stayed behind in the cockpit where it was safer. They went together, because that is what the two of them did, and that is what they had been doing for however many years led up to that night. And when the wave came, her husband got his hands on her in the North Atlantic, in a gale, in the dark. He very nearly brought her home.